Welcome. Welcome to week 2 of MPAI 760 here at Georgetown University's Applied Intelligence Program. I think we had a good first week. We got people on board, and I think we had some good comments on the discussion boards, and I look forward to your papers, reading them. First, I'm going to try and get a couple of announcements before I review the week 1. I mentioned about getting together for a happy hour. It's always something that I've done in previous places I've taught, and it's always, I think, at least good opportunity to network, good opportunity to meet people face to face, good opportunity just to have a good time. And I always had a good time with those. So I'll give you more details on that. We'll do that in late August or so. Um, your paper 1 is due. I don't know when you're going to be watching this, but it's probably due pretty soon. I will get you comments by Tuesday or Wednesday so you can incorporate those comments into your next papers as well. But again, for most people in this class, I've probably read or written a paper or graded a paper for you, so you probably have a good idea of what I'm looking for overall. So reviewing week 1, again, good comments, good history. One thing I want to discuss is what is a terrorist, what isn't a terrorist. And the Hoffman chapter 1 goes into detail on it, and I sent an article as well to a couple of you on what do we call terrorism, who becomes a terrorist, who doesn't. The 3 people, Begin, Mandela, Bembella, the people that I had you study in depth, at the time they were all considered terrorists. But history has vindicated them. Mandela died in 2013, and there was a stadium full of world leaders mourning his death. Begin is a great peacemaker. He's thought of as a great peacemaker now. Bembella, again, is thought of as the founder of Algeria. So, again, at the time, they were called terrorists, but history has vindicated them. And the question is why? Why are these people considered statesmen, freedom fighters, while others, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, isn't? And I'll give a couple of definitions for Mandela. One, make no mistake about it, Mandela advocated violence. He advocated violence. And if you go on his YouTube videos, you'll see a young Nelson Mandela saying, if we can't achieve through nonviolent means, then violence is our only option. He should not be conflated with Gandhi. Should not be conflated even with Martin Luther King. He did call for violence. The difference is, well, there's 2 differences. One, his violence was focused against the apparatus of oppression. It was the South African regime that was involved with apartheid. That's one. Number 2, most people would agree the cause, apartheid, was worth extraordinary measures. The level of oppression was so bad that apartheid was worth what almost any countermeasures, including violence, you can use. That's why Mandela, for all intents and purposes, is not considered a terrorist. Menachem Begin, again, as you saw in those videos, he engaged in violence. But I think there's probably the same principles as Mandela fall with Begin. He focused his attacks against the apparatus of government, against government, civilians, and military, and not against random civilians that like Al-Qaeda does or ISIS does. That's one. And 2, and I believe this, we can have a debate. I think the backdrop of the Holocaust and the violence perpetrated in the Holocaust did give Begin some sort of legitimacy, and the state of Israel some sort of legitimacy to continue his actions. So again, that's why at the time Begin was considered a terrorist, but for the most part, history has judged him a lot more kinder. And then Bembella in Algeria, I want to make something very clear. He engaged in violence against civilians, and he admits it in that video that I sent to you. He did some not very nice things. The suicide bombers that we've seen in the last 10 years, this was a tactic pioneered by Bembella. He focused his attacks on French civilians and Algerian sympathizers, civilians, people in pizza parlors and in birthday parties and in weddings. So these weren't military bystanders. He did commit violence. So why isn't he considered a terrorist? Well, some parts still consider him a terrorist, but again, he gets called for a freedom fighter because, again, the cause, many people argue that the cause, freedom from colonialism, freedom for the Algerian people, was worth a little bit, I don't want to say a little bit, a lot of violence in that case. So that brings up a lot of questions. When is, what level of oppression do you get to commit violence against civilians at? Clearly, people think Ben Bella, good portion of Ben Bella, was, I don't want to say authorized, but he had no choice to commit violence against civilians. The other point that Ben Bella did not do is he didn't target Parisians, French people in Paris. He didn't target French people in France itself. His focus against civilians was within, as you heard, the locus of conflict in Algeria. It wasn't like Osama bin Laden just blowing up the trade towers or ISIS conducting attacks in the United States. It was focused in the grievance area. So I think those are reasons why Ben Bella and Mandela are not considered terrorists. And I want to leave you with this. Is Charlottesville, for those of you who don't remember, a year ago there was protests in Charlottesville and it resulted in one person dying. Is that terrorism? Should it be considered terrorism? And I bring this up, and what I want you to do is, when you acknowledge that you viewed this video, is say, should it be terrorism? Yes or no? And then give me 2 sentences to justify that it should be terrorism. But again, I want you to start thinking through the criteria, what should be considered terrorist, what should not be considered terrorism. And the one thing I just want to say about Charlottesville is, if you want to call it terrorism, okay, I can guarantee you if instead of neo-Nazi flags in Charlottesville, there were ISIS flags, and instead of saying anti-Semitic things, they were saying death to U.S. soldiers, I guarantee you there would be no question that would be considered terrorism. I guarantee you they wouldn't have gotten a permit to rally in Charlottesville if it was ISIS flags and Islamic extremism. So, if you're going to say Charlottesville is terrorism, you have to ask why the double standard. Because clearly, again, I don't think Al-Qaeda or ISIS sympathizers could rally so openly as alt-right, white nationalists, whatever you want to call them, as they did in Charlottesville. So just, again, a couple of sentences on Charlottesville. Is it terrorism? Is it not? When you acknowledge this video. And then the 4 waves of terrorism. I think that article gave it very succinctly on the historical waves of terrorism and the tactics they use to achieve their objectives. A question I get is, what's the next wave? I've heard a cyber wave is going to come. I don't necessarily believe that. I think cyber is in the domain of states and criminal activity, not necessarily terrorists. But I also think what might happen is a wave of eco-terrorism. I think global warming, and I do believe in global warming, I think it's going to cause certain actions to occur where people are going to lose their homes, they're going to lose their farms, they're not going to be able to eat because of various droughts, and then they're going to conduct terrorist attack that might have a little bit of sympathy against rich industrial nations, even some of the polluters in rich industrial nations that might gather sympathy. And you can imagine, again, we talk about what is definition of terrorism. If you're in West Africa and you're starving because of rich countries are polluting or causing global warming, and you conduct an attack in a rich country and say that's your cause, is that terrorism? Is that justified violence? Again, that's something to consider. So I just want to wrap up with the week 1 review is just, again, going through the 4 waves. What you see on the top is the Irgun, and as you remember in the video, the 2 people that died that were hung, the 2 British soldiers. What the Irgun did, and what all these groups that you see pictures of, is they were able to use the media of the day to advance their message. That's what we talked about, successful terrorists in the discussion section. That's what a successful terrorist does. They are able to capitalize on media. And that picture there was teletype pictures. Back before World War II, you took a picture, you had to mail it, and it got sent out 3 weeks later. After World War II, an invention during World War II is you could send a picture instantaneously throughout the world through teletype. It was the YouTube of the day of 1947. And Menachem Begin understood that picture told the story that about the Irgun and gave publicity to the cause. Again, terrorists used teletype photography in that first picture. Second picture, Black September. Those of you who don't remember, although probably most of you weren't born at the time, the Munich Olympics in 1972. Black September took Israeli athletes hostage, and unfortunately all the ones that they did take hostage were killed. They were taking advantage of 24-hour color TV, which was a new phenomenon in 1972. So the Olympics were one of the first broadcasts of color TV. First time there was 24-hour coverage. They knew they were going to get coverage for their cause, and that's why they conducted their attack. ISIS, again, I think they're obviously taking advantage of YouTube, Facebook, social media to get their message across. And that's that picture that's depicted there. So a successful terrorist group will always take advantage of the media or be savvy with the media of the day. And I just want to kind of leave you with that as we're talking about, and again, one of the themes of this course is patterns that we see throughout history. So week 2 preview, again, state sponsorship of terrorism. You have the Byman articles, and those are a pretty good framework to look at state sponsorship. And when you're reading through those, think about what I call as tier 2 state sponsors: Venezuela, Russia, North Korea. These are, again, people who groups that engage in low-level cross-border violence. And then I call them the tier 1, the Pakistan and Iran, are really fall into that category. These are engage in a lot more, that use terrorism as a tool, again, what we call terrorism, as a tool to advance their national objectives, a critical tool. And then finally, for your paper, look at how U.S. supports terrorist groups. Mujahideen al-Khaliq, MEK, Kurdish groups to advance our objectives. And that's a key point to look at. And again, I want you in this paper to, it's kind of like a think piece here, expound on the U.S. goals and desires for supporting these groups. So if there's any questions or issues, please let me know. And let me know if there's any problems, and I look forward to the discussion section.